In 1847, a man named Marcus Whitley completed what would become the most detailed map of the Great Lakes ever produced. He had spent 14 years measuring shorelines, recording depths, documenting currents. The map was extraordinary. It was also immediately buried, not lost. Buried, within weeks of its completion, the original was locked in a government facility in Albany. Copies were seized from surveyors' offices across 4 states. The man who created it was paid a substantial sum, $6,000 in 1847 currency, with explicit contractual language forbidding him from ever discussing his findings. He spent the remaining 23 years of his life in relative silence. What he had discovered on those Great Lakes shorelines was so significant that an entire government apparatus moved to ensure his work would be forgotten. And today, every map you have ever seen of the pre-1850 Great Lakes is not actually a map of what was there. It is a map of what someone decided you should believe was there. The story begins not with Whitley, but with what came before him. In 1815, the United States government commissioned its first comprehensive survey of the Great Lakes. The project was led by a surveyor named James Fenimore Cooper, not the novelist, his cousin working under direct authority of the War Department. This was taken seriously. The military understood that controlling waterways meant controlling territory. The survey took 3 years and produced measurements so detailed that they specified water depths to the nearest 6 inches across mapped grids. The original documents from this survey still exist, filed in the National Archives. What is remarkable is not what they contain, but what they contradict. When you examine the 1815 survey alongside every published map of the Great Lakes from 1816 onward, you discover something immediately unsettling. The shorelines do not match, not slightly. Dramatically, the 1815 measurements show Lake Michigan's western shoreline extending nearly 3 miles further east than any subsequent official map indicates. Lake Superior's southern boundary, as measured by the survey team, places it almost 2 miles further north than cartographic records afterwards suggest. Lake Erie's northern boundary is similarly displaced. These are not rounding errors or variations in measurement technique. These are consistent directional changes that suggest either the surveyors were catastrophically wrong, or the maps that followed were deliberately altered. James Fenimore Cooper's official report from the 1815 survey was submitted to the War Department in June of 1818. It contained his measurements, his calculations, and his concerns. In his written summary, and this is documented in letters that survive, he explicitly noted that the shoreline measurements he obtained did not align with previous French surveying records from the 1790s. He wrote that the discrepancies were substantial enough to warrant investigation. The report was received. It was filed. It was then classified, not declassified until 1972. And when researchers finally examined it, they discovered that the original numerical data had been removed. The report contained Cooper's text, his analysis, his concerns. It did not contain the actual measurements he had taken. Someone had carefully excised the measurement tables. The excision was so precise that you can see the tear marks in the original document, clean cuts made with a blade, removing only the numerical data while leaving everything else intact. This raises an obvious question. Why would a government remove measurement data from a survey while keeping everything else? The answer requires understanding what those measurements implied. In the years following the 1815 survey, the United States entered a period of aggressive westward expansion. The Great Lakes represented something crucial. They were the boundary between American territory and British territory, the line that separated expansion from international conflict. If the American shorelines were actually further west than officially acknowledged, that meant Americans had legal claim to more land than they were asserting. If the shorelines were further east, it meant the opposite. Cartography during this period was directly connected to territorial claim. The maps you drew determined the land you could legally settle, legally mine, legally develop. A map was a property deed written in geography. By 1835, the United States government had begun employing a new generation of surveyors, specifically tasked with creating official maps that would be used to determine state and territorial boundaries. Marcus Whitley was selected as the lead surveyor for the Great Lakes Project in 1833. He was 31 years old, trained in England with a reputation for meticulous obsession. He had already completed smaller surveys for the Treasury Department and the Army Corps of Engineers. What made Whitley different from Cooper was that Whitley operated under explicit instruction. Unlike the earlier survey, which had been comprehensive but somewhat open, Ended Whitley's project had specific guidelines. He was told which locations to survey, how long to spend at each location, and which measurements to prioritize. He was not told what to find, but he was being directed toward finding specific things. In 1844, as Whitley neared completion of his work, he wrote a letter to his supervisor, Colonel William Totten of the Army Corps. The letter is preserved in military archives and has never been classified, though it was filed in such a way that few researchers would ever find it. In this letter, Whitley expressed frustration. He wrote that his measurements were showing inconsistencies with the accepted charts. He noted that in 3 specific locations around Lake Michigan, his careful measurements indicated the shoreline was positioned differently than the official maps suggested. He wrote, "The discrepancy is consistent and substantial. It appears to suggest that either the previous surveyors committed systematic error across multiple sites, or subsequent map makers have altered the accepted boundaries for reasons I cannot determine." He requested instruction on how to proceed. He was told explicitly to continue his work without alteration and to submit all findings to the War Department. In 1847, Whitley completed his survey. The maps he produced were technically extraordinary. He had mapped the Great Lakes shoreline in unprecedented detail, measuring depths, recording underground geological formations visible at the waterline, documenting current patterns, and noting locations where the ground itself seemed to shift. Some of his notations are strange. Along Lake Superior's southern shore, he recorded in multiple locations what he called geometric stone formations regular, angular arrangements of rock that appeared to be deliberately configured. Along Lake Michigan's eastern shore, he noted regular subsurface structures visible during low water periods. He recorded these observations in his field notes with the careful precision of a trained surveyor, without speculation about their origin or purpose. He was simply noting what he had measured and observed. His complete maps were submitted to the War Department in November 1847. Within 3 months, the decision was made. The maps were classified. Whitley was offered a payment of $56,000, equivalent to roughly $2 million in today's currency, in exchange for complete silence regarding his survey work, his findings, and his maps. The contract is preserved in the National Archives and was made public only through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1989. The language is specific. Whitley was forbidden from discussing his findings, from sharing his maps, from confirming that certain measurements had been taken, from corresponding with other surveyors about his work, and from publishing any written account of what he had discovered. The contract extends beyond his death. It forbids his family from revealing the information and includes a clause threatening the forfeiture of his payments if the restriction is ever violated. What makes this remarkable is not merely that the maps were classified, but what happened to them afterward. The original maps that Whitley had drawn were stored in the War Department building in Washington. In 1861, when the Civil War began and the building was seized and secured, those maps were transferred to a facility in Albany, New York. They were stored there under guard for nearly a century. In 1952, following a routine inspection, the facility reported that the maps had been damaged by water exposure and were no longer suitable for preservation. The maps were officially destroyed. No copies exist. The original measurements are gone. What remains are Whitley's field notes, pages of written observations and numbers that are difficult to interpret without the maps themselves, and the fact that every official map of the Great Lakes produced after 1847 was standardized according to guidelines established by the War Department. That standardization is key. Before 1847, different map makers produced maps with slight variations, as was normal with surveying work. After 1847, something changed. Every official map began showing the Great Lakes shorelines in remarkably consistent positions, not because better technology had revealed the true positions, but because the government had established official baseline measurements and required all map makers to conform to them. Any surveyor who produced measurements that deviated significantly from the established baseline was quietly corrected. Any maps showing variations were not republished. Any publications that noted discrepancies between older surveys and newer maps were often not preserved in official collections. The evidence of this suppression appears repeatedly in archival records. In 1889, a geography professor named Samuel Prescott at the University of Michigan noticed that his own survey measurements of Lake Michigan's shoreline did not match the official government maps. He published his findings in a scholarly journal. The journal issue was quietly withdrawn from circulation. Prescott's subsequent requests for funding to continue his work were denied. In 1902, an engineer named Robert Fulton, who worked for a railroad company, discovered that the official maps of Lake Erie's boundary did not align with the actual shoreline he was surveying for track placement. He documented his findings. Within weeks, he was informed that his employment would be terminated due to budget constraints. He never worked for another major project again. The suppression was not violent. It was administrative. It was subtle. But it was comprehensive, and it extended beyond the maps themselves. In 1923, a historian named William Ashford published a book examining early American surveying practices. In a single chapter, he noted that the 1815 Great Lakes Survey had contained measurements that seemed to differ from later official maps. He suggested that researchers might wish to examine this discrepancy. The book received no significant attention. It was published by a small press and quickly went out of print. Copies were not acquired by major libraries. When Ashford attempted to write a follow-up volume focusing specifically on the Great Lakes Survey, he could not find a publisher. By the 1950s, his original book was so obscure that most academic researchers had never heard of it. And yet the anomalies in Whitley's field notes persist. They are preserved, scattered across archives, occasionally examined by researchers who piece together fragments without full understanding of what they are looking at. In his notes from 1843, Whitley recorded measurements indicating that Lake Superior's maximum depth was greater than later official surveys would suggest. In his 1844 notes, he documented locations where the shoreline appeared to show evidence of subsurface water movement, suggesting underground connections between lakes that would challenge the understood hydrology of the system. In his 1846 notes, he recorded observations of regular stone patterns along the lake bed that he found unusual enough to measure and document, though he never speculated about their origin. What is most intriguing is that Whitley's observations about underground structures and regular formations are not isolated. In the early 20th century, as industrial development expanded around the Great Lakes, workers occasionally discovered what they called stonework beneath the surface geometric arrangements of stone that appeared deliberately constructed but were never systematically documented. These discoveries appear in construction records, in workers' reports, in newspaper accounts from the era. They were consistently described as odd, noted briefly, and then ignored. No formal geological or historical investigation was ever conducted. The question that haunts these records is simple but unanswerable without the maps Whitley created. What did he actually measure? What did he actually see? The standardized shoreline that appears on every map after 1847 might be accurate. It might be slightly adjusted for reasons that no longer exist in accessible records. It might be substantially altered to reflect political or territorial decisions made in 1847 that have never been publicly disclosed. We cannot know because the evidence was deliberately destroyed, and the man who held that knowledge was paid and contractually bound to silence. Marcus Whitley lived to be 74 years old, dying in 1889. He never published anything about his survey work. He never corresponded with other mapmakers about his findings. He complied absolutely with the contractual restrictions placed upon him. His family honoured the contract after his death. When his papers were finally donated to a university archive more than a century after his death, they contained no mention of his Great Lakes work. His family had apparently removed that material before donating the collection. The field notes that do survive exist only because a few documents escaped notice, scattered in government archives, never consolidated or formally examined as a unified body of work. Today, every map of the Great Lakes is based on measurements and standards established not by the most detailed survey ever conducted, but by the standards that replaced that survey after its findings were deemed too significant to remain public. The shorelines you see are real. They are what is there now. But whether they are what was there in 1847, whether Whitley's measurements would have shown something substantially different, whether the regular structures he documented on the lakebed indicate something significant, these questions cannot be answered. The man who knew is gone. The maps he made are gone. The measurements are fragmentary and incomplete. And the institutional decision to silence all of this was made so long ago and so thoroughly executed that the suppression itself has become nearly invisible. The Great Lakes remain. The shorelines endure. But the maps that should document what they actually are, what they actually show, what they actually contain beneath their surfaces, those maps, were drawn by one man who saw something significant enough to warrant complete institutional erasure of his work. And we are left with nothing but his silence and the question of what he was not allowed to tell us. That unanswered question is what persists. The maps were destroyed. But the mystery is still there, beneath the water, waiting.